Thank you. Again, good morning, everyone. This is Sarah Bushman. I'm the Division Administrator. Apologize for the little bit of a delayed start this morning. We're at capacity for attendees, and we're trying to increase that because we've got an overwhelming interest, as many of you, again, are anxiously awaiting what we're going to share with you today. So we'll also be sending an email out to folks. If we can't increase capacity, we'll be doing a second webinar to ensure that folks who have questions are able to answer them. So I want to start with just a little bit of where we're at today in the program. So as many of you may be aware, President Trump has twice tried to zero out the Community Block Grant Program in his proposed budgets. Twice Congress has restored that funding to the program, and in fact has increased funding in the last funding bill, and I believe the THUD bill that just passed through committee on the House side, I believe yesterday or the day before, maintains that increase. So what this puts us at is the folks over at HUD, they would like to be able to show Congress that continued CDBG funding is critical to states. So the issue with that, though, is that HUD is concerned that many states, including Wisconsin, currently have significant CDBG dollars in revolving loan funds that are not being used in communities. As you see in the last bullet point on this slide, in Wisconsin, we're currently sitting at over $100 million in approximately 133 ED revolving loan funds. Over half that funding is cash on hand and not revolving. I'm going to turn it over shortly to Dave Polish to talk a little bit more about that, but in HUD's perspective, that is incredibly problematic, and their expectation is that funding should be revolving every 12 months. Dave's going to talk a little bit about the challenges, but I'm sure all of you are keenly aware, especially in smaller communities, those opportunities to actually revolve that money may not actually present themselves with that level of frequency. So we skipped over the slide before that, but basically what we're going to cover today is the program history, the compliance history, and then talk about our proposed pathway forward, which is a CDBG economic development RLF closeout program called CLOSE. We had our public hearing opened yesterday for the public comment period for 30 days. We really view this as a great opportunity to mitigate some of the risks that we see that are currently facing the program as a whole, the state, you as the local communities that are in charge of your RLFs, and also ask the federal government for far more flexibility in how to spend this money. As I indicated, many of you are keenly aware of the challenges of that narrow lane of trying to contain within economic development, ensuring that that money is revolving. As we all know, CDBG, the larger umbrella, has many more pathways that the funding can be used for. Our goal with the CDBG CLOSE program would be to allow you to sort of go down any CDBG lane and use that funding for anything that falls under that umbrella, including a portion of that which Wisconsin, through our normal funding streams, does not allocate money to, and that's public service projects. And we've seen from other states that that can be a great use of CDBG funding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Polish to give you a little bit of the background of the program history and how we got to where we're at today.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So program history.
Sorry, folks, we're still having a little bit of difficulty. We're trying to get Dave up and running here. I think I'm going to start as we're trying to fix his technical issues. So as you can see on the slide in front of you, back in 2012, the Washington Post ran a story that was critical of HUD and of home and CDBG. So that led to increased scrutiny by the Office of the Inspector General, which led to increased scrutiny of state programs by HUD. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what the Office of Inspector General is, that's the law enforcement arm of HUD. That is completely separate from their programmatic folks, and they have broad authority in the Office of the Inspector General, and quite frankly, that was the states were told back in March from at a national conference that Dave and I were at, that the Office of Inspector General is looking at the issue of HUD oversight of RLFs, and so that's a key piece of information to keep in mind. Dave, do we have your technical issues solved and we can let you pick up here?
Yes, we're ready to go. Thank you, Sarah. So taking off from where Sarah left off, the increased scrutiny that's being looked at by the Office of Inspector General, that included a lack of accomplishment data within local revolving loan funds, lack of meeting a national objective, and in some instances an ineligible use of the funds. So this is was a pervasive issue all across the nation, not just special to Wisconsin, but this is an issue that they've been dealing with across the nation. But Wisconsin, lucky enough for us, we were at the top of the list to start getting some technical assistance and monitoring early this spring. So back in March of 2018, Sarah and I were at a national conference where we were able to talk to HUD staff, and they told us that the Office of Inspector General was really changing their focus and starting to look at these revolving loan funds at the local level. States were strongly encouraged to review and tighten up their revolving loan programs or to look at them and close them out. Many states have already discontinued that use of CDBG funds for economic development projects due to the ongoing complexities of overseeing local revolving loan funds. And as many of you can appreciate, that oversight and the issues are with that is the Davis-Bacon compliance, the environmental review compliance, and all the reporting that goes along with these projects. It's just a lot of complex and technical information that's made it challenging to oversee these funds at the local level. So in 2012, to give you a little more history, Wisconsin's Economic Development Program was monitored by HUD, and we were issued several findings. Since 2012, we've been working with a lot of you locally and also our business partners to close out old projects and obtain accomplishment data. In a lot of instances, that information was not available. And so to address those outstanding audit findings of not meeting a national objective or jobs were not created, the state had to make repayments to HUD via cash, actually, and grant reductions of the tune of $16 million back in 2015. $15 million of potential repayments are still in play according to HUD. Again, we've worked diligently to reduce that number. We feel that number is more in the $5 to $6 million range, and we're waiting a final letter from HUD to close out those findings and issue their final determination on what those repayments may be. So again, that was looking at the state's economic development program. In 2017, HUD also looked at our economic development program once again, including the RLFs, and followed up with a monitoring in May of 2018, which was just completed. So we're awaiting the results of that monitoring, which should be issued within 30 to 45 days, putting it towards the end of June or early July. So it'll be interesting. We know some findings are coming with that. So with compliance, the RLF program is very challenging to operate. We've got over 130 locally held revolving loan funds, and many of those only make a loan or two a year, and several haven't made a loan in more than 10 to 15 years. So many RLFs, they don't routinely or consistently revolve that money and do not generate enough program income annually to continue to revolve those funds. And that's really evidenced by the money that is sitting in the bank accounts of many locally held RLFs. Again, as Sarah mentioned, over 50% of the money within the RLF program is sitting in cash, and that balance has continued to grow. Since the initial monitoring in 2012 by HUD, that cash balance has grown by 33% being held in banks. So local governments are supposed to have the capacity and the knowledge to operate the program in accordance with HUD rules and regulations. The state's role is to monitor compliance with those federal rules and regulations. And we've taken that over back in 2013. The CDBG program was transferred to the Department of Administration, where we began that process, really detailed, making the list of who has these revolving loan funds and what the status of those revolving loan funds are. And as you all know, you've been continuing to monitor and submit semi-annual reports to the department so we can see how things are going. And obviously through our monitoring, we know that local governments are having challenges correctly administering the RLF-ED program. So HUD was aware of compliance challenges in Wisconsin, and they've informed the state that they will be receiving a number of findings related to the recent monitoring of the RLF-ED program. And so we feel that there's a lot of risk out there with the local RLF program being open. So the most significant risk is that there could be full repayment of those loans that are out there that you cannot meet a national objective or don't have the proper job documentation. HUD requires that to be very detailed information. They look at your self-certifications, and if one isn't even filled out correctly, they'll kick it out. So we don't want HUD to be looking down at the local level. We want to be proactive at the state level to mitigate some of that risk. So back in March, when we had our conference out in Washington, D.C., HUD referred us to take a look at an RLF-ED closeout program that was recently created by the state of Illinois. Illinois had the same history Wisconsin did, high cash balances and local revolving loan accounts, and also a lack of compliance and just not able to document all the good things that had been done with the CDBG money, whether it was job creation. That documentation just didn't exist. It wasn't collected back in the day. The other issue that we're going to be seeing when we do receive the monitoring is what is the reporting requirements of HUD going to look like going forward if we continue to operate as we are. And we were informed that the monitoring and the reporting is going to significantly increase. HUD will require the state to be more involved in the front end of the loans that you're making currently by looking at your underwriting and determining if these are solid projects and viability. And obviously, we would rather not, and I don't believe we have the capacity to take all that information on. So the state, we're going to be looking at seeking approval from HUD for a substantial amendment to the state's comprehensive plan and to create an ED RLF closeout program. A major benefit of going to the closed program is it's going to create flexibility that currently does not exist in the RLF program. And that flexibility being, as Sarah mentioned earlier, in that right now your RLF programs can only be used for economic development. Doing the closed program, those monies are going to be reprogrammed to be able to be used for other eligible CDBG activities. So many of those projects that we talk about as being eligible are going to include public infrastructure projects, housing projects, planning projects, and really a new twist is we're going to be looking for approval to do public service projects such as job training, food pantries, opioid treatment centers. So we're trying to open the box up, if you will, so people are going to have the ability to use these funds for a variety of CDBG eligible projects. Other benefits of the closed program will be those dollars that are returned to the community as a grant will not require any matching funds. They'll be non-competitive and can be applied for any time for up to 2 years once this program is initiated. So a reminder, this is not defederalizing these funds. The funds would come back to the state and be granted back to the municipality. They would still have the CDBG requirements of meeting a national objective or be an eligible activity, and they still, again, have to meet all the federal rules and regulations. We're just checking the question list right now to see if we can answer some of the questions that have been submitted so far. One question submitted is, can RLF funds be used to purchase the first mortgage to prevent foreclosure or to take possession of the building for another economic development opportunity? That's a really very specific question that I think we'll get back to you on. We would need to really do some research on it and make sure that everything was in order. So specific questions like that, project questions, probably hold off and we'll answer those specifically for the type of project that you're looking at. But please feel free to submit questions that are more broad-based and open to the RLF-ED closeout program. And so now I think I'm going to turn it over to Mark. The next question really refers to how we're going to do the calculations on things. So Mark is going to walk through how the CDBG program works, and we'll detail out how the funds will be returned to the state and how those calculations are made.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I think we'll address the question that came in about the calculations through some of the slides. If we haven't, we'll try to answer that towards the end of the next section. All right, so how will this work? The state is seeking approval from HUD for a substantial amendment to our comprehensive plan to create the ED-RLF closeout program, similar to the state of Illinois. So currently, the state has a 5-year comprehensive plan that explains how we're going to use our CDBG allocation and those details. And in order to process a change such as the CDBG close program, we have to seek a substantial amendment for HUD. Because we're basing it on the Illinois plan, we think it's a more straightforward road to approval than to create or substantially change what has already been approved by HUD. Upon receiving approval from HUD, the state will establish a start date for the CDBG close program. Our target start date is October 1st of 2018, or when HUD approves the program, whichever date is later. So if HUD takes longer to review past that October 1st date, the start date will be pushed back to when HUD does approve our substantial amendment request. At that time, so either October 1st or that later date that HUD approves, local RLFs will be required to discontinue making new economic development loans. The state will work with communities to determine the amount of funding in their closeout account. So a final closeout report similar to the semi-annual report will need to be submitted along with supporting docs to verify the closeout balance. So we're going to be modifying the report that you used to submit for the 930 and the 331. We're going to change it a little bit, so it's going to look fairly similar, but we're going to use that so you guys report your cash on hand again, as you usually do, your outstanding loans, and we'll use that along with the supporting documentation to work with you to establish what your closeout balance will be. A couple of questions came in. If we are allowed to grant funds to a company, does this open the door for a 105A15 program to create a new loan pool? Currently we have our READY program, which is how the 105A15 process to defederalize funds is being used. So we will still have that available from the state. You can apply to those funds with an eligible job creation, housing, and possible job training program. Again, more details about that program is on our website. This process will not allow for defederalization of funds. Another question we have here is there are multiple prospective applicants in the next 3 to 6 months for one local municipality that does not appear to fit the current closeout program. I'm not sure what you mean by current fit. However, we do have our state economic development program that will still be available. Instead of applying to the local municipality, businesses are welcome to work with the municipality to submit an application for state economic development funds, and then the state will do the underwriting and be the award or issue an award to the business if it is deemed compliant. Next question is, can non-entitlement dollars be used in an entitlement area? And now we are keeping with the established limits of non-entitlement dollars staying outside of those entitlement areas. Entitlements such as the larger counties of Dane, Milwaukee, and Waukesha do receive their own funding directly from HUD. I guess if you have specific questions about a specific project, if it might benefit residents outside of the entitlement as well, please contact us after the webinar and we can discuss projects like that specifically. Another question, how do we handle current prospects we are working with that see the RLS as an incentive with our recruiting? Is it on the table now or frozen? If frozen, how can we get back on the table? So your funds are you're still allowed up until the start date of the close program, again, that October 1st, or the later deadline if HUD doesn't approve those funds immediately. If you are unable or unwilling to make those funds out of those loans out of your local account, again, the state has waived the requirement to use all local funds in an RLF prior to applying for state funds, and so that you can work with the business and apply to our our allocation that we've set aside for economic development projects. Just reading another question here. We're getting a lot of questions here, but I think we might be able to answer some of these as we continue to go through the slides. So let's go back to the slides for a little bit, and then we can come back to some of the questions coming in. All right, so again, how this will work, the cash on hand balance as well as the loan receivable balance for any outstanding loans will be paid back to the state within a 2-year period. So again, whenever that start date happens, if it's October 1st of 2018, by October 1st of 2020, those balances would need to be turned in to the state. Communities that cannot repay the outstanding loan balance in the 2-year window will assign the loan back to the state at the end of that period. However, those balances will not be held for the community to reuse through the CDBG closed program. So if you don't have the capacity at your local level and can't come up with the capital to pay back those outstanding loan balances, that is okay. That is not a requirement, but you would lose the opportunity to reuse those funds at the end of the closed program, and those loans would just be assigned back to the state for collections going forward. So funds returned to the state minus any RLF losses for failed loans will be held specifically for that community for a period of up to 2 years. Under certain circumstances, communities with large balances may be granted an extension to use the funds. So a couple points here. Communities that turn in funds, that will not go into a larger pool that will be held specifically for your community to reuse. So again, if just for a random example, if your community had $100,000 that it turned back into the state, that would be held for that specific community to apply for eligible projects to reuse that $100,000 period. And again, there will be a 2-year period to turn in those funds and apply to reuse them. And if you're reusing a project for construction or whatever it might be, you would have an additional 2 years from the start date of that project to complete that project. And communities with large balance, like we said, may be granted extensions to use the funds. Currently, Illinois does not have that available, but the state will be requesting additional flexibility in our program to HUD. So if you have a large balance and it may take additional time to be able to utilize or find those projects, we are asking for that flexibility to use those funds. Local communities may apply to the state for the use of eligible projects in the 2-year period. So like I said, once you turn those in within that same 2-year period, you can apply to reuse those for any CDBG eligible project, not just economic development as they are currently only available for today. And again, they will have 2 years from the time of application to complete that project. So again, like we stated previously, you have the RLF cash on hand balance. If you're able to turn in those account receivables, that would be included as well. And subtracting any RLF losses would equal the CDBG closed balance that would be accessible for your community to reapply for. Once the state receives the cash on hand and receivables, any outstanding loans in the portfolio would continue to be paid back to the unit of government and would no longer retain the federal identity. So I think this is a big point and a large carrot for this program. So if a community is able to buy out their receivables account, so again, let's just pick a random number. If you have $100,000 in outstanding loans that are going to be paid back to your RLF, and if you are able to buy those out in advance, submitting that $100,000 back to the state, we will hold that amount in the close account for you to reuse in addition to your current RLF cash on hand balance. But then you still have those businesses that are paying those loans back to your local municipality. And at that time, those are defederalized. You are buying out the federal identity, and you'll have the opportunity to double the receivable balance. So again, $100,000 will be returned to the state and held here to be applied for an eligible project and granted directly back to the community. And then the businesses, once they repay back, the community could use those to establish a defederalized revolving loan fund that would have no federal requirements of any kind. You could establish it without job creation requirements or anything of that sort. Or you could community could use those funds to reimburse whatever account paid out those funds to begin with. But you have the opportunity to turn that $100,000 receivable balance into a $100,000 grant coming back to the community and the $100,000 in repaid funds from the outstanding loans to turn that $100,000 into $200,000. So we understand this is a complicated process, and so here's a little bit of a flow chart for you. Under the UGLUG on the upper left-hand side, that stands for Unit of General Local Government, so cities, towns, villages, counties. You have your RLF cash on hand, plus your loan receivables. That would be paid back to the Division of Energy, Housing, and Community Resources. And so the RLF cash in hand and the loan receivables minus any losses would create the closeout account and be granted back to the UGLUG for those eligible projects. And then those local funds that, then those funds that are at the local businesses that are repaying your RLF account, those would become defederalized and allowed to also be retained at the local level. Here's again a specific example of how this might work. So the City of Hope, Wisconsin has an RLF cash balance of $250,000. They have a receivable balance of outstanding loans in the amount of $350,000. The amount due from the city to the state would be $600,000. In this particular example, the city has a planned utility and street replacement project planned for next year. The estimated cost would be $750,000 that may benefit greater than 51% of low to moderate income persons. The city has $400,000 saved for this project in utility accounts and was planning to borrow $350,000 for the street portion. If the city repays $600,000 to the state would certify that the City of Hope close account has $450,000 available. In this situation, there's $600,000 that was returned minus $150,000 in loan losses in their RLF account, and that would be available for the city to use on CDBG eligible projects. The city will use the following sources to repay the state. So they had the cash balance of $250,000 in their local account that would be just transferred to the state, and they're using the $350,000 in those utility accounts to come up with the $600,000 total. So sources that are able to fund that street and utility project, $600,000 from the CDBG close program, the utility account, $50,000. The City of Hope would come up with $100,000 additionally for a total of $750,000. And additionally to that, the City of Hope retains the future payments of principal and interest coming from the loan receivable balance that had been bought out that is now defederalized. And a potential reuse of the repayments of those could be to reimburse the city for $100,000 in borrowing, reimburse utility accounts in the amount of $250,000, or those repayments could be used to recapitalize the RLF, and again, that was now defederalized and doesn't have those federal restrictions on it. All right, so we're going to go to a couple questions now. Can the funds be used for county capital projects? So these funds that would be in your CDBG closeout account can be used for any eligible CDBG product under the umbrella. So if your capital project is CDBG eligible, if it benefits 51% or greater low to moderate income persons, depending on what those capital projects are, yes, that could be eligible to be used for that. What happened, is there a way to transfer all outstanding loans in cash to a local nonprofit organization to take over a program that would remove the loans from the federal oversight? No, there is not. Again, the process that is established through the federal rules to defederalize funds has not been followed. That process has to be done up front. Simply transferring to a nonprofit does not remove the federal identity of those funds. There's a question about sending the balance in the account or the municipality maintain the funds. Those funds would come back to the state and be held here to be reapplied for by the municipality when you have an eligible project within that 2-year period. But the funds do need to come back here and will be held and reprogrammed for the reuse. Will the state be managing existing loans, reporting, and collecting payments? If you have a revolving loan that does not buy out to those receivable, and after 2 years those funds or those loans do get assigned to the state, then we would be managing the repayments and all aspects of those loans going forward. If those are bought out during that 2-year window, those funds and those loans would become defederalized, and the state would not monitor or deal with those repayments. Again, so it kind of depends on which option you're able to do. More questions. The closeout list for the community to repay funds. Excuse me. The closeout list for the community to repay funds that are lended out to companies. That is not possible from local budgets. Again, we understand that the CDBG program is in 132 units of government throughout the state. There will be some governments that are unable to do that, and if that is the case, after the 2-year period is up, those existing loans can be transferred back to the state. But we do want to point out again, if you have funds budgeted for activities in the next few years that would be CDBG eligible, you can take those funds that have been set aside for those activities, return it to the state, and then the state would grant funds directly back to you. So we have staff here that can work and discuss options with you for projects you may have already budgeted for, you have upcoming in the next few years, to determine whether those are CDBG eligible or not. So certainly follow up with us and we can work with you on that. What is the time period for RLF losses? All past losses or losses from current loans. So that would be any loan that you've made out of your RLF account that was not able to be collected on and have written off. And in that case, that would be if you hadn't been able to collect, collateral or any other protections you had when you made the loan. Any of those write-offs would be considered losses. Again, going through the questions, what is the process for receiving funds from a closed account? A new process or an already established program? So that's a very good question. We have established many programs here at the state level, public facilities projects for roads, water, sewer, workforce housing. We have these applications that are currently established and will be used and slightly modified to be used as the application, the non-competitive application for your funds for eligible projects. For things like public services, if you choose to do that activity going forward, the state has not done that in the past and will be creating an application to be used before this loan, the CDBG closed program starts, either again October 1st or when HUD approves. Again, just reading some of the questions coming in. Can funds earmarked for a particular community be used for lead water mains and lead water laterals? They certainly could if it's in a 51% or greater LMI community, or if just that particular area where those water mains are used, if you're just replacing them on a particular street, you could survey the residents on that street to determine their eligibility at 51% or greater, and yes, that is an eligible reuse under the public facilities national objective. What if you can't pay the accounts receivable? So again, we understand that some communities may have trouble coming up with those funds to pay that off. And so you'll have, at the end of the 2-year period, if you are unable to do so, those existing loans then would be assigned back to the state, who will assume the collection and loan monitoring from there on out. If an organization wants to use those funds for capital projects, what would be the charged interest rate to the unit of government? So the reuse of these funds will entirely be grants. We will grant these funds back to you. And unlike our current public facilities or other programs that we have, these will have no match. You will not be competing with other units of government to access these funds. These will be the funds will be set aside specifically for you and will be granted back with no match, I think with the cap of $3 million for a particular project. So question is, this isn't much notice to have to come up with this by October 1st. October 1st is just the proposed start date for this program. Again, for you to come up with funds to buy your receivables or just transfer your cash balance, you'll have a period of 2 years to do that. And then again, if you do it towards the end of that 2-year period and are starting projects, then you would then have 2 years from the start of the project date to complete those projects that you're using those grant funds back to you for. Do all CDBG closed projects still need to follow the original federal regulations? For example, Davis-Bacon environmental studies? Yes. So these funds still retain their federal identity. So when you give us those cash on hand balances and buy out the receivable balance, those funds that will be granted back to you still needs to follow all federal regulations. The caveat is if you do buy out, you still have that receivable balance being paid to you by the businesses that currently have those outstanding loans. When those funds get paid back to you, those do not retain their federal identity, and again can be used to establish a defederalized revolving loan fund or reimburse the community, or really it's up to the community's discretion for whatever they want to do with the program. Can a community pick and choose which loans they want to buy out? What about after the 2-year period has passed? Will their funds still be available? So if a community can't come up with the total amount of the outstanding loans or the receivable balance to pay off, they could pay off 1 or 2 of those loans and not the whole balance, and still have that be available for the RLF account, and then the other loans that weren't bought out during that time at the end of the 2-year period would be returned to the state for administration and collections after that period. And again, we want to point out that for those communities that do have those larger balances, we are asking HUD for that additional flexibility and additional time to be able to reuse those funds. So if you have a larger balance and are concerned that you may not be able to utilize those funds within the 2-year period, we are asking for additional flexibility and additional time for you to come up with those projects. So again, still going through the many questions here. Would you please re-explain the process, required process that would allow the funds to become defederalized and create a replacement RLF for the community? So certainly, so we have our READY programs, the Rural Economic and Area Development Initiative, and that project combines workforce housing with economic development. Those 2 portions are required. Job training is an optional addition to that. There's up to $500,000 for economic development projects, up to $300,000 for housing, and up for $200,000 for the job training component. And how that would work, an established community development organization that has been approved by the state would work with a local community. The community would submit an application to the state. The state would grant the funds for an eligible project to the community. The community would then grant those funds directly to a community development organization, that CDO, and the CDO would then make the loans to the business and to the housing with a potential to do, again, the job training as well. And when those funds get repaid from the housing developer and the business, those would become defederalized and would be allowed to be held at the local community development organization to be utilized. Again, the national objectives still need to be met on the first go around, so that would be the low to moderate income housing and the low to moderate income job creation. But again, if that meets a national objective, those funds become defederalized and are allowed to be held at that local community development organization. Yeah, and that opportunity for those funds has been available currently. We have, I think, 7 CDOs that are throughout the state. If more want to be established, that information is on our website. And if you have additional questions on that, please let us know. Again, more questions here. Will the other CDBG programs still be valid because of this mixed potential for funds to take place of those programs? Excuse me as I take a quick drink of water. Yes, we will still have our public facility and we will still have our housing programs. I guess the added benefit to communities that have revolving loan funds would be you can still apply for our, say, public facilities funds if you have a street project and you have a balance that you have available in your closeout, and you can still apply for our public facilities funds. And because your closeout funds do not need match, you can actually use that as match for up to our $500,000 PF and even access more capital to do that public facilities project. And again, to talk about, just to jump back real quick to the question about, does the CDBG closed program still retain that federal identity? So again, the Davis-Bacon for construction, the environmental reviews, the national objective for low to moderate income job creation, those are all still required and should be done at your current RLFs. So for your projects, those still need to have your environmental review submitted, even if it's for equipment purchases. That still needs to be submitted to the Department of Administration. Again, if you have construction you're doing, you still need to follow Davis-Bacon wage rates. These are requirements of the program and the money that you currently have there, and have been required and still will be required going forward. And for, again, when we met with HUD, and HUD talked about the risk that we have at the state, and had looked at some of the local revolving loan funds, they're aware that there is compliance issues throughout the state. And we asked them how far they might look back if they were going to look back, and there is no limit. If HUD or the Office of the Inspector General would come in and look at your local RLF, it would not just be in the last year, 2, 3, or since DOA took over. It is the entire history of the program. And so if there are compliance issues from projects going back, those would still present a compliance risk if you don't have, the documentation to ensure in your file for older projects, even let's say in the year 2000, that the people that were hired in the jobs were low to moderate income. If you don't have environmental reviews approving your project in the file, and this closed program and following the Illinois model reduces that compliance risk in the local communities. By following this in Illinois, it has not led to HUD going and looking at the individual RLFs in your project files, and that is really what we're trying to do here. In addition to provide that carrot for the possible doubling of the receivable balance, this is really a push by the state to ensure compliance and reduce that possible repayment risk, because that is the penalty. If HUD finds projects that haven't met a national objective or haven't followed other federal rules and regulations, the state has had to pay excuse me, $16 million in the past on funds, and if HUD found that at the local level, they do have the right to request those funds back. So this CDBG closed program certainly has its benefits going forward for the flexibility of the use, for the possible doubling of the receivable balance, but really the main point as well is to reduce that compliance risk that currently exists for the local RLFs. I'm going to switch to Dave here to go through a few more of the questions and wrap this up.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Next question, could we do a blight elimination project that does not serve 51% LMI? Actually, by meeting a national objective of blight elimination or slum and blight removal, you do not have to meet the 51% LMI requirement. So by doing a slum or blight project, and a lot of communities in rural Wisconsin have a building in their downtown as an example that they may want to declare blighted and demolish it, and you could use these CDBG funds for that activity. We need to be a little bit cognizant that there is a limitation on how much slum and blight you can do statewide through our program, so we'd have to watch that a little bit. However, it is an eligible use of the funds. Another question, 22 years ago we received $500,000 in CDBG funds. Currently have $340,000 in cash, but $760,000 in receivables. Am I correct in understanding that we would be returning $1 million to the state even if the original disbursement was $500,000? Yes, that's correct. That's the correct understanding. So with that $500,000 that you originally received, obviously you've been revolving that money, and so that has grown via interest payments to now the total fund balance is $1 million when you add your cash and your receivables together. However, that's all federal funds, so the interest earned on that money still maintains its federal identity, and it's still, that money is still determined to be HUD funding. What action do you need to write off uncollected loans before calculating closeout? So in looking at what action you need to take to declare it written off is you need to obviously do, try to collect all that money that you can through your security arrangements. Again, but you must document that that attempt has been made. That was one of the compliance issues with a lot of RLFs. There was weak attempts at collecting on collateral or foreclosing on bad loans. So you need to document that those activities have been undertaken. How will the public service cap work if an UGLUG chooses to use RLF funds for public service, but the state is receiving the program income? That question is that we're working on right now with HUD. Public service projects are something that the state has not undertaken in the past, so we will be looking at doing that, and right now we're working with HUD to define how that's going to be done. What are the restrictions for any defederalized funds? So that question, the defederalized funds that you would be looking at would be the repayments that are coming from the businesses that you would have bought the loans out of. So yes, those would be defederalized funds. There would be no restrictions on that because you bought out that federal identity. So those repayments from the business, that would be unrestricted defederalized funds. You could either use those to recapitalize a revolving loan fund that wouldn't have a federal identity, or to reimburse the municipality or the account that was used to buy out those receivables. How does this affect the READY program that we were told about? This program really doesn't affect READY. READY still exists. READY is really the pathway to creating a defederalized revolving loan fund via that relationship of the community receiving a grant from the state, and then the community granting those funds to a community development organization who in turn loans those dollars for an economic development and a housing project. Those repayments to that community development organization then are defederalized. So this does not impact the READY program. I'm just scrolling through the questions now to see if some of these are repeats. Can you explain the 51% community criteria? So the 51% criteria is the low to moderate income benefit calculation. So projects that are being granted the funds from the CLOSE program must meet the national objective of 51% low to moderate income or slum and blight removal. That 51% can be determined via census tract data or the HUD census data for your community. If you have a neighborhood project that you're looking at doing, you can undertake an income survey. Those methodologies are on our website currently for our public facility program. So the reuse of those funds would be mirroring that type of activity. So that's how that would be explained. Is there a minimum loan through the CDBG close? So we're looking at strictly grant funds being sent right back out to the municipality for public facility and any type of eligible CDBG project. So there is no minimum loan amount. We're looking at grants. There is no minimum grant amount. And we're looking at multiple projects. You can do up to 2 projects, and for communities which would have a large closed balance, we may have flexibility to do more than 2. So please clarify the time frame in which write-offs are eligible to be considered in the grant monies. So this is really looking at the history of the revolving loan program as far as the CDBG funds going back to the beginning of when you received your first grant. We have your reports, so we know the track record there that's been reported, so we'll be utilizing that base data, and as Mark mentioned earlier, you'll be submitting a new report as part of the closed project. So we're looking at the full history of the revolving loan fund. If we pay back the full amount, is it possible for the full amount to be granted back to the county within the same fiscal year? Absolutely. In an ideal situation, when the county or any municipality returns the funds to DOA, that application for the reuse of those monies could follow that, and those grant dollars would be pushed right back out to the community. So we can turn that around quite quickly. Regarding the subtraction of program losses in the closed program equation, does this include all defaulted loans since the establishment of the RLF? That is correct. However, when calculating that balance, you still will never receive less than your cash balance. So you'll always be able to get the cash balance back. That calculation of the loan losses is only applicable to the loan receivables. You look at that net amount. Will semi-annual reporting continue during the 2-year period? That's a good question. Probably not. What we'll be looking at doing is submitting that as part of your closed program. And also we would be stopping having any more new loans established as well. Do the defederalized funds have to follow the current HUD rules for something like Davis-Bacon? No, the defederalized funds, which are the repayments by the businesses within your receivables that you'd be buying out, those would be defederalized, and those repayments then would not contain a federal identity, and so you would not have to follow the federal rules and regulations on the reuse of that money. Is it all or nothing when paying the state back on receivables? If we can pay only some of the receivables back to the state, can we choose which specific loans we pay off and which we turn over? We're still working on that internally, the logistics of if that can work or not, so stay tuned for further information on that detail. Can a community use CDBG closed funds to acquire and clear blighted properties for redevelopment? Yes, that would be meeting the slum and blight elimination national objective, so that would be an eligible use of the closed funds. And in that case, again, as I mentioned earlier, that would not have to meet the LMI national objective. You use the word grant a lot. Do the grants need to be repaid, or are they given with the intent that they will not be repaid? That's the definition of a grant. So those grants that would be provided back to the municipalities, though they're clearly that, there is no repayment of those funds. Have sat on cash balances. There should be a benefit for those who have been active lenders rather than take away funds that expect to borrow in order to repay the state. So we, as a state, obviously we have to look at the totality of the program, and yes, there are some revolving loan funds out there that have been active, but a majority are sitting on cash balances in excess of what HUD will allow. And so again, the risk that we're standing out there is significant, because if HUD comes in, there may be no way for you to recoup these dollars, and so the state's trying to establish a methodology where, yes, the money comes back to the state, however, we're granting that right back to the community. It's being done in Illinois. HUD has approved that, and so obviously we're still waiting for the HUD findings that will be coming shortly, and we're looking to see what those are, and we feel by getting up in front of this, we're going to be able to make this happen, because if HUD comes in and just says no, and we're not out in front of this, there may be no reuse of the funds. It'll just be coming back to the state and back to HUD. Reviewing additional questions. So we've got time for just a couple more questions. if we want to use closed funds for a road project, how would you determine LMI impact to that road project? I would suggest you take a look at our public facilities program manual for that and our application packet. Be very similar. The community, it's really on you to determine what the benefit areas that and that we concur. If it's a main thoroughfare through town, obviously the benefit of that road is greater than just the people that are living on it. So you need to determine if that road serves a neighborhood or if it serves a larger portion of the community. So that'll just have to be determined at the time of application. And again, Decker staff will be available to help with those determinations. We're here to come out, look at the types of capital projects. We want to make sure these communities can all use those dollars when they come back to the community. So we're willing to work with you very hard to make sure you can benefit from these funds. At this point, we're going to cut off the questions. Again, we will be able to follow up and type up an FAQ and answer all your questions in the near future. But right now I'll be turning it back over to Sarah Bushman.
All right, again, technical difficulties. As I was saying, we've had a lot of great questions today, and as Dave indicated, we'll be putting an FAQ on our website. Also, if you have further questions that are far more detailed, some of the questions were very specific to particular projects, those are probably better left to a phone call to Dave or to Mark or to any of the CDBG team members who can direct you to that. We're also willing to, if you've got board members, if you've got other folks that you're responsive to that have questions, we understand that part of this process is going to be outreach, and so we're committed to a very robust schedule to do that, and we're we've already talked to the board of directors for the Counties Association. We'll be in continuing conversations with them, same with the League of Municipalities, with the Economic Development Association. So they've also, those three organizations have given us further opportunities at conferences coming up over the next several months to continue to answer your questions and get information out there. I just want to wrap up. You see the final slide, and again, we have a substantial amount of money sitting out there that I feel that $100 million pushing back out to you, with half of that being sitting in bank accounts, that can really revitalize a lot of your communities, and I don't want to put any of that funding at risk. As Dave mentioned, we're awaiting the HUD findings, but at a minimum, HUD's expectation of how the state is doing business with these RLF funds cannot continue. So I know some of you feel like you currently have more flexibility, but if the state were to be told by HUD that we have to ensure that you're in full compliance with every HUD regulation on the front end, we have a small team to do that. Our capacity to do that is limited, as is your capacity. And so again, when we look at the pros and cons of getting out ahead of the risk, I feel like we've got a great pathway here. We're asking for far more flexibility in that funding. And again, we've tried to increase the number of carrots, as you will, and limit the sticks. Again, at the end of the day, couple of years goes by, you're a community that can't afford to repay that, you're simply turning that back to the state. So the penalties on the other end, I like to tell people as I've come to the department over the last year plus, that HUD has an expectation that a project that is 99% successful is 100% failed and 100% payback. So unfortunately, they're a funder that has no gray area, and the state has, as Dave indicated, has seen the impact of that, and I really want to ensure that local communities don't feel that going forward. So we do appreciate everyone's time today. We're going to be doing another webinar at 11:30 for those who could not join. So if you have been on this one, you should have received an email while you've been on this. We'd appreciate that you not rejoin, because we are limited in how many folks can attend. And as we said, we will continue to answer your questions offline and put information for the most frequently asked questions on our website, and continue to ensure that we're communicating with as much information as possible as we go forward in this process. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator to give any final thoughts and any technical information she needs to convey before we wrap this up.